Did you know nuns faked their own deaths to leave their convents? Or that some were spirited away in herring barrels under the cover of darkness? And believe it or not, royal princesses sometimes led armed rebellions from within their supposedly peaceful cloistered walls. Life behind convent walls wasn't always serene prayers and quiet contemplation. For some, it was a cage from which they'd risk everything, even their souls, to break free. Number 8. The nun who faked her own funeral. The audacious escape of Joan of Leeds. Picture this. It's the early 14th century, around 1318, in York, England. Inside the Benedictine nunnery of St. Clement by York, also known as Clementarp, a young nun named Joan of Leeds was, to put it mildly, not having a good time. We don't know exactly why Joan was so desperate to leave. Was she forced into the convent by her family? A common practice for daughters who couldn't be married off with a suitable dowry. Did she find the strict rules, the endless prayers, the separation from the world simply unbearable? Or perhaps, as later events suggest, had her heart found a reason to be outside those stone walls? Whatever her reasons, Joan wasn't one for half measures. She didn't just sneak out a back door. Oh no, Joan of Leeds orchestrated an escape so bold, so theatrical. It sounds like something out of a medieval play. First, Joan pretended to be terribly ill. We can imagine her fellow nuns fussing around her, their brows furrowed with concern, perhaps a little bit of fear. Sickness in a close-knit community like a convent could spread quickly. Joan, it seems, was a convincing actress. Her illness worsened, or so she made everyone believe. Day by day she grew weaker, her voice fainter, until finally she was declared dead. Now, faking your death is one thing. Getting everyone to believe it is another. Joan, or someone helping her, had a plan for that too. A dummy, a likeness of her body, was prepared. This effigy was then solemnly placed in a coffin. The nuns of St. Clement, likely with genuine sorrow and prayers for her soul, conducted a full funeral service. They buried the dummy in a sacred cemetery, mourning the loss of their sister Joan. They had no idea they'd been tricked. Meanwhile, the very much alive Joan of Leeds was out free. But what does a runaway nun do in medieval England? According to the records of the Archbishop of York, William Melton, who was clearly not amused when he found out Joan didn't exactly go on to live a life of quiet piety elsewhere. The official documents state that after her death and burial, she simulated a bodily illness, and not dreading the pains of hell, shamelessly pretending to be dead, procured her own burial in a sacred place of the said house. And where did she go? The Archbishop's register notes that she had turned to a carnal, worldly life, and was living indecently and notoriously. Archbishop Melton discovered Joan's incredible deception. How? The records don't specify, but secrets, especially scandalous ones, have a way of getting out. Perhaps someone recognized her. Perhaps a guilty accomplice confessed. Whatever the case, Melton was furious. He wrote a stern letter to the Dean of Beverley, demanding that Joan be found and publicly admonished to return to her convent within 15 days. If she refused, she faced excommunication, A terrible fate in that deeply religious age, effectively cutting her off from the church and, in the eyes of many, from salvation. What happened to Joan of Leeds after the Archbishop's order? Did she defy the powerful church and continue her life of carnal pleasure? Was she dragged back to St. Clement's, shamed and punished? Or did she disappear again, perhaps more successfully this time? Frustratingly, the historical record falls silent. We don't know the end of Joan's story. But her audacious, almost unbelievable escape, faking illness, death, and burial, remains one of history's most daring jailbreaks from a medieval convent. It's a testament to one woman's desperate desire for a different life, whatever the cost. Number 7. Smuggled in herring barrels, Katharina von Bora and the Great Nun break. It's Easter Eve, 1523. The air in Saxony, Germany, is thick with more than just the scent of spring. It's buzzing with the radical new ideas of Martin Luther and the Reformation. Inside the walls of Marienthron, a Cistercian convent in Nimschen, a group of nuns, including a determined young woman named Katharina von Bora, felt this buzz keenly. They weren't just hearing about Luther's challenges to the church. They were reading his writings, smuggled into their supposedly isolated world. And what they read resonated deeply. Life in Marienthron, like many convents, was one of strict routine, prayer work, silence, and devotion. For some, it was a fulfilling spiritual path. But for Katharina and at least 8 other nuns, it had become a prison. They had taken vows, yes, but now with Luther arguing that monastic vows were not biblically mandated and that salvation came through faith alone, those vows felt like chains. They yearned for a different life, one perhaps involving marriage and family things Luther also championed for clergy and former monastics. But how does a group of nuns simply walk out of a well-guarded convent? It wasn't like they could just pack their bags and say goodbye. Escaping was a serious offense, both religiously and legally. They needed help. Secretly, they managed to get a letter to Martin Luther himself, pleading for assistance. Luther, a former monk, was sympathetic to their plight. He believed they should be free to leave if their consciences dictated. He resolved to help. Luther entrusted the daring rescue mission to a man named Leonhard Koppe, a merchant and town councillor from Torgau. Koppe regularly delivered supplies, including herring, to the Marienthron convent. This gave him the perfect cover. The plan was audacious. Koppe would smuggle the nuns out in his covered wagon hidden amongst the empty fish barrels or beneath tarpaulins. On the night of April 4th, 1523, under the cloak of darkness, Leonhard Koppe arrived at the convent with his wagon. One by one, 9 nuns, Katharina von Bora, Magdalena von Staupitz, Elsa von Kaunitz, Lanetta von Golis, Ellie von Grosen, Margrethe von Schönfeld, Elisabeth von Kaunitz, perhaps a relative of Elsa, and Ursula von Spiegelberg, slipped away from their cells, their hearts no doubt pounding. They climbed into Koppe's wagon, concealing themselves as best they could. Some traditions say they were hidden inside the smelly herring barrels, a detail that makes the story even more memorable, though it's possible they were simply hidden amongst them or under other goods. The journey was tense. They had to pass through territories still staunchly Catholic, where they could be arrested and forcibly returned. But Copy was clever and brave. He successfully navigated the roads and delivered his precious and probably very uncomfortable human cargo to Wittenberg, the heart of the Reformation movement, on Easter Sunday. Once in Wittenberg, Martin Luther took responsibility for the escaped nuns. This was no small matter. He was essentially harboring fugitives. He worked to find them suitable places to live, employment, or, ideally, husbands. For Katharina von Bora, her journey took an unexpected turn. After a couple of potential suitors didn't work out, and she herself famously declared she would only marry Luther or his associate Nicholas von Amsdorf, the great reformer himself proposed. In June 1525, Martin Luther, the former monk, married Katharina von Bora, the former nun. Their marriage became a powerful symbol of the Reformation's break with Catholic traditions regarding celibacy. Katharina, or Cathay, as Luther affectionately called her, became a formidable partner managing the household finances, a brewery, and a farm, all while raising 6 children and hosting countless students and visitors. She was far from a quiet, submissive wife. She was an intelligent, capable woman who had risked everything for a new life and found it in a most unexpected way. The daring escape in herring barrels was just the beginning of her extraordinary story. Number 6. The Royal Rebels, Trodild and Basina's Convent Uprising. Long before Joan of Leeds faked her death, or Katharina von Bora hid in a fish barrel, 2 Merovingian princesses, Trodild and Basina, staged one of the most violent and scandalous convent revolts in history. This wasn't a sneaky escape in the dead of night. This was an all-out rebellion. The year was 589, and the place was the prestigious Abbey of the Holy Cross in Poitiers, Francia, modern-day France, a convent founded by the revered Queen Radegund. Trodild was a daughter of King Cheribert I, and Basina was a daughter of King Chilperic I. As royalty, they likely expected a certain level of deference even within the cloister. The abbess Lubovera, however, seems to have run a tight ship. Trodild, in particular, found the conditions intolerable. She complained about the food, the clothing, and claimed that the abbess was treating her and other well-born nuns with disrespect, making them perform menial tasks beneath their station. Whether these complaints were entirely justified or fueled by royal pride, they became the spark for an astonishing uprising. Trodild decided she'd had enough. She didn't just plan to leave, she planned to take over. She rallied a faction of about 40 other nuns, including Basina, to her cause. One dark night, they abandoned the Abbey of the Holy Cross. But they didn't just melt into the countryside. Trodild led her band of disgruntled nuns to the nearby Basilica of St. Hilary. This wasn't a sanctuary for quiet prayer. It became their fortified headquarters. From St. Hilary's, Trodild began to recruit. She gathered a motley crew of murderers, adulterers, thieves, and criminals of all kinds, according to the historian Gregory of Tours, who chronicled these events with a mixture of shock and disapproval. These weren't just bodyguards. They were a private army. Trodild, the renegade nun, was now a warlord. Her goal? To oust Abbess Lubovera and presumably install herself, or a more sympathetic figure in her place. The situation escalated dramatically. Trodild's armed gang terrorized the region. They attacked the lands belonging to the Abbey of the Holy Cross, looting and pillaging. They even sent thugs to try and seize Abbess Lubovera herself, roughing her up in the process. The local bishops were horrified. They tried to reason with Crodilde and Basina, urging them to return to their convent and submit to ecclesiastical authority. The royal nuns, however, were defiant. They claimed they were going to see their royal relatives, the kings Guntram and Childebert II, to plead their case directly. The bishops, including Gregory of Tours himself, excommunicated the rebellious nuns. This was a serious step, meant to bring them to heel. But Crodilde and her followers were undeterred, at least initially. The standoff continued, with violence and chaos spreading. At one point, when bishops attempted to enter St. Hilary's to reason with them, Crodilde's thugs attacked the clergy, beating them and stripping them of their robes. It was a shocking display of disrespect for church authority. Eventually, royal intervention did occur, but not in the way Crodilde might have hoped. The kings ordered the matter to be settled by a council of bishops. The rebellion was suppressed, not without more bloodshed. Crodilde and Basina were brought before the council. Despite their outrageous actions, their royal blood likely saved them from the harshest penalties. Basina, seeming more penitent, was eventually allowed to return to a convent, though perhaps not wholly cross initially. Crodilde, more stubborn, remained defiant for longer. Some of the nuns who followed them were also eventually readmitted after performing penance. The Poitiers nun rebellion was a stunning episode. It showed that convent walls couldn't always contain worldly ambitions, grievances, or even outright violence, especially when royalty was involved. Crodilde and Basina didn't just escape. They went to war, leaving a trail of scandal that was recorded for posterity. Number 5. Defying family for faith. The flight of Clare of Assisi. In the spring of 1212, in the bustling town of Assisi, Italy, a young noblewoman named Clare Offerduccio faced a future that many women of her class accepted, an advantageous marriage arranged by her wealthy and powerful family. Clare, however, had other ideas. She was deeply moved by the teachings and lifestyle of a Hainadic local figure, Francis of Assisi, who had renounced his own wealthy background to live a life of poverty and preach the gospel. Clare was just 18, but she possessed a strong will and a fervent spiritual desire. The glittering prospects of a noble marriage held no appeal for her. She yearned for a life dedicated to God, a life of simplicity and service, much like Francis and his followers. But her family, the Faveron, would never approve. They had plans for her, and those plans did not involve her becoming a penniless devotee. So, Clare decided to escape. This wasn't an escape from religious life, but an escape into it, against the formidable opposition of her kin. Her flight was carefully, if perhaps hastily, planned with Francis's knowledge and support. On the night of Palm Sunday, March 20th, 1212, while the rest of Assisi was asleep or occupied with holy observances, Clare, accompanied by her aunt Bianca Guelfucci and perhaps another companion, slipped out of her family's grand house. Legend has it, she didn't use the main door but rather a seldom-used side exit, sometimes described as a door of the dead, an opening in the wall used for carrying out coffins, usually bricked up, but perhaps accessible in Clare's case, symbolizing her departure from her old life. Under the cover of darkness, Clare and her companions made their way through the winding streets and out of the city walls to the little chapel of St. Mary of the Angels, also known as the Portiuncula. This was where Francis and his small band of friars were based. Francis and his brothers met her with lighted torches. Inside the humble chapel, in a deeply symbolic ceremony, Francis himself cut off Clare's long, beautiful hair, a sign of her renunciation of the world and her commitment to a religious life. She exchanged her fine, noble garments for a rough, penitential habit. That night, she took her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Her family, of course, was furious when they discovered her gone. This was not just a daughter's defiance. It was a public embarrassment and a disruption to their social and political ambitions. They tracked her down to the Benedictine convent of San Paolo degli Abbadesi, near Bastia, where Francis had initially placed her for safety. Her uncle Monaldo arrived with a group of armed men determined to drag her back home, by force if necessary. What followed was a dramatic confrontation. Clare refused to leave. When her relatives tried to physically remove her, she clung to the altar cloths, baring her shorn head to show them that her commitment was irrevocable. She declared that she would serve only Christ. Faced with her resolute determination and the sanctity of the altar, her family, though enraged, eventually had to retreat without her. To ensure her safety from further family attempts, Francis soon moved Clare to another Benedictine convent, Sant'Angelo di Ponzo, on the slopes of Mount Sabazio. It was here that her younger sister Agnes, inspired by Clare's example, joined her, also escaping from the family home despite even more violent attempts by their uncle to retrieve her. Finally, Francis established Clare and her growing number of followers in a small, dilapidated house adjoining the church of San Damiano, which he himself had rebuilt. This became the first home of the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares. Clare of Assisi's escape was not about fleeing harsh convent rules or seeking worldly pleasures. It was a courageous act of spiritual conviction, a flight from societal expectations and familial control to embrace a radical life of poverty and prayer. Her determination laid the foundation for one of the most influential female religious orders in the Catholic Church, an order that continues to this day. Number 4. From Queen to Nun, Radegund's escape from a brutal king. Born a Thuringian princess around 520 AD, Radegund's early life was steeped in violence and political turmoil. Her father was murdered by her uncle. Then, when she was just a young girl, her homeland was conquered by the Frankish kings Clothar I and his brother Theuderic I. Radegund was taken as war booty, part of the spoils. Clothar, one of the 4 sons of Clovis I, decided to raise her at his villa in Athis, Picardy, providing her with an education. When Radegund came of age, around 540 AD, Clothar forced her to marry him. He was a notoriously brutal and licentious king, known for his many wives and concubines and his violent temperament. For Radegund, who was devoutly Christian and inclined towards asceticism even as a young queen, life at the Merovingian court must have been a gilded cage, if not an outright nightmare. She endured the marriage for years, finding solace in prayer, fasting, and charitable works, often to the king's annoyance. She founded a hospital and tended to the sick herself. The final straw came around 550 AD. Some sources say a bit later, around 555 to 560 AD. Clothar in a fit of rage or political calculation, murdered Radegund's younger brother. This brother was one of the few remaining members of her Thuringian royal family and had been living under Trothar's protection. For Radegund, this act of senseless cruelty was unbearable. It severed any remaining loyalty or obligation she might have felt towards her husband and king. She resolved to leave him and dedicate her life entirely to God. Escaping a powerful and possessive king like Clothar was incredibly dangerous. He was not a man to be defied. But Radegund was determined. She fled the royal court. Sources say she initially went to Noyen seeking out the bishop Medard. She pleaded with him to consecrate her as a deaconess, a role that would officially remove her from secular life and her marital obligations. Bishop Medard was hesitant. Consecrating the king's wife, effectively sanctioning her departure from the marriage, was a politically risky move that could incur Clothar's wrath. The king's men were already pursuing Radegund. Legend has it that Radegund, in a dramatic gesture, entered the sacristy, put on a monastic habit herself, and returned to Medard, essentially forcing his hand. "If you refuse to consecrate me," she reportedly told him, "and fear man more than God, the shepherd will demand this soul from your hand." Moved by her piety and courage, or perhaps fearing divine retribution more than royal anger, Bishop Medard relented and consecrated her. Clothar was, as expected, furious. He tried to get her back, but Radegund, now a deaconess, was under the protection of the church, at least to some extent. She initially lived a life of prayer and penance in various locations. Eventually, with Clothar's reluctant, or perhaps politically expedient consent, she settled in Poitiers. There, around 557 AD, she founded the Abbey of the Holy Cross, one of the first double monasteries in Gaul, for both men and women, though primarily known as a nunnery, and a major center of learning and piety. Radegund herself did not become abbess, but lived as a simple nun within its walls, devoting herself to extreme asceticism, prayer, study, and care for her sisters. She obtained a relic of the True Cross for her abbey, a hugely significant acquisition that gave the abbey its name. She corresponded with prominent poets and churchmen of her day, like Venantius Fortunatus, who became her close friend and wrote extensively about her life. Radegund's escape was not just a flight from an abusive marriage, but a courageous assertion of her spiritual autonomy in an age when women, especially royal women, had little control over their own lives. She transformed herself from a captive queen into a revered saint and influential monastic founder, leaving a lasting legacy. Her abbey in Poitiers would later become the scene of another famous or infamous event involving nuns, the rebellion led by Crodilde and Basina, ironically defying the very institution Radegund had created as a sanctuary. Number 3. The sorcery suspect. Agnes de la Forcie's desperate flight. The 15th century was a time of deep religious fervor, but also of growing anxieties about witchcraft and demonic influence. For a nun accused of such dark practices, the convent walls could transform from a sanctuary into a terrifying prison. Such was the harrowing situation faced by Agnes de la Forcie, a nun whose story unfolds in Cambrai, a town in northern France, around the 1450s or 1460s. Agnes had originally been a nun at the convent of Montreuil-les-Dames, near Laon. At some point, she left this convent, or as we might say, escaped. The reasons for her initial departure from Montreuil-les-Dames are not entirely clear from the surviving records, but it seems she did not leave with permission. She made her way to Cambrai, perhaps seeking anonymity or a new life. However, her past and new accusations would soon catch up with her. In Cambrai, Agnes found herself in serious trouble. She was accused not just of apostasy, the crime of abandoning her religious vows and her convent, but also of sorcery. This was an extremely dangerous charge. The inquisitorial machinery of the Church was well established by this time, and those suspected of witchcraft or demonic pacts faced terrifying interrogations and often brutal punishments. The Inquisitor Pierre Le Broussard took charge of Agnes's case. Under interrogation, a harrowing picture emerged, though we must remember that such testimonies were often extracted under duress or leading questions. Agnes reportedly confessed to a series of shocking acts. She claimed that a lover had taken her from her original convent. This alone was a serious sin, a betrayal of her vows. But her alleged transgressions went much further into the realm of the occult. She was accused of creating love potions, perhaps to ensnare her lover or others. More ominously, she was said to have fashioned wax figures. In the magical practices of the time, creating a wax effigy of someone and then melting it, pricking it, or otherwise damaging it was believed to cause harm or even death to the person it represented. This was considered a particularly malevolent form of sorcery. Agnes was also accused of invoking demons. Her case illustrates the precarious position of women, especially those who defied societal or religious norms. A runaway nun was already an outcast. Adding accusations of witchcraft made her situation desperate. The very act of her escape from Montreuil-les-Dames might have been reinterpreted by her accusers as evidence of a flight from God and openness to evil influences. We can only imagine Agnes's terror. Trapped, facing a powerful inquisitor, and accused of crimes that could lead to a painful death, what options did she have? The records focus on her alleged confessions and the charges against her. Did she try to escape from her imprisonment in Cambrai while awaiting judgment? The term escape in her story can refer to her initial flight from Montreuil-les-Dames, which set the stage for her later troubles. Or perhaps she made a desperate bid for freedom from the Inquisitor's grasp, though historical accounts are scarce on this specific detail. The narrative that often emerges from such trials is one where the accused is already presumed guilty, and the interrogation is designed to confirm those suspicions. Agnes's story, as filtered through the inquisitorial records, paints her as a fallen woman who turned from God to illicit love and then to the dark arts. What was the ultimate fate of Agnes de la Faucille? The detailed outcome is not readily available in easily accessible historical summaries. However, for a nun found guilty of apostasy and sorcery in the 15th century, the prognosis was grim. Penalties could range from severe penance and imprisonment within a harsher monastic regime to, in the most extreme cases, execution, often by burning. Agnes de la Faucille's story is a chilling reminder of the dangers faced by those who stepped outside the rigid boundaries of medieval society. Her escape from one convent led her into a nightmarish accusation of sorcery, a desperate situation from which true escape or justice was tragically unlikely. It highlights how easily a woman's bid for freedom or a different life could be twisted into something sinister in an age gripped by fear of the supernatural. Number 2. Love and a Runaway Nun. The Elopement of Beatrix de Rijke. Not all convent escapes were driven by theological disputes or faked deaths. Sometimes it was simply about love. In the year 1473 in the Netherlands, a young nun named Beatrix de Rijke decided that her heart lay outside the walls of the Marienthron convent, an Augustinian house near Leiden. Her heart, it turned out, belonged to a clerk named Jacobus de Wild. Life in Marienthron would have been one of regular prayer work and adherence to the Augustinian rule. For many, this was a path to spiritual fulfillment. But for Beatrix, the allure of a life with Jacobus proved stronger than her monastic vows. We don't know how Beatrix and Jacobus met, or how their forbidden romance blossomed. Perhaps Jacobus had business with the convent, or maybe they knew each other from before Beatrix took her vows. Whatever the circumstances, their connection grew to the point where they were willing to risk everything. Leaving a convent, especially to elope, was a serious matter. It was a betrayal of sacred vows, an act of apostasy that could lead to excommunication and social disgrace. For Jacobus, helping a nun escape and then living with her was also a grave offense. But love, as it often does, found a way to defy the rules. Together, Beatrix and Jacobus planned her escape. One day, Beatrix slipped away from Marienthron, leaving behind her habit and the structured life of a nun. She met up with Jacobus, and the pair fled to the town of Gouda. Gouda was a bustling city, famous for its cheese, but for Beatrix and Jacobus, it represented a chance at a new life together, away from the immediate reach of the convent authorities and perhaps Beatrix's family. They began to live as husband and wife, a scandalous arrangement in the eyes of the church and society given Beatrix's status as a consecrated nun. News of her elopement eventually reached her family and the Marienthron convent. Her father, whose name was Rijke, hence Beatrix de Rijke, meaning Beatrix, daughter of Rijke, was understandably distressed and likely embarrassed. He tried to intervene. He traveled to Gouda to persuade Beatrix to return to the convent, to repent for her actions and resume her religious life. Imagine the scene. A father pleading with his daughter, appealing to her sense of duty, her fear of God, her family honor. But Beatrix was resolute. She had made her choice. She refused to go back. Her life was now with Jacobus. The convent authorities also didn't give up easily. Losing a nun to elopement was a blow to the community's reputation and a spiritual concern. They too made efforts to retrieve Beatrix, to bring her back into the fold and have her perform penance for her apostasy. But Beatrix and Jacobus seemingly managed to evade these attempts or resist the pressure. The story of Beatrix de Rijke and Jacobus de Wild is known to us primarily through a chronicle written by a contemporary, Brother Wouter Jacob Zoon, a prior of the Stein Monastery, who recorded events in the region. His chronicle notes that Beatrix and Jacobus went on to have children together. This detail suggests that they managed to build a family life, despite the illicit nature of their union in the eyes of the Church. What happened to them in the long run? Did they eventually find a way to legitimize their relationship, perhaps as the influence of the Church changed in later years? Or did they live out their lives under a cloud of ecclesiastical disapproval? The chronicles don't always give us the full picture. However, the fact that their story was recorded indicates its noteworthy, perhaps even scandalous, nature at the time. Beatrix de Rijke's escape wasn't a grand rebellion or a complex theological statement. It was a deeply personal act, a choice for love and a secular life over the cloister. It's a reminder that behind the austere image of medieval monasticism, human emotions and desires continued to beat strongly, sometimes leading individuals to take courageous or foolhardy leaps into the unknown, all for the sake of love. Number 1. The Chaplain and the Nun, Isabella de Benstede's forbidden flight. In the early 14th century, around the same time, Joan of Leeds was plotting her dramatic death. Another English nun, Isabella de Benstede, also found convent life unbearable, but her escape involved a classic tale of forbidden love. Isabella was a nun at the Priory of St. Mary de Pray, a Benedictine house located near St. Albans in Hertfordshire, England. The priory was established for leprous nuns, but later took in other women as well. Life at St. Mary de Pray, like any well-ordered Benedictine convent, would have revolved around the Opus Dei, the work of God, the daily cycle of liturgical prayers, manual labor, and sacred reading. But for Isabella, it seems her heart and mind were increasingly drawn elsewhere, specifically towards a man who should have been upholding the spiritual sanctity of the community, a chaplain named John de Marienthron. Chaplains served convents by saying Mass, hearing confessions, and providing other spiritual services. They were, of course, expected to maintain a strictly professional and celibate relationship with the nuns. However, proximity and shared humanity sometimes led to bonds that crossed these sacred lines. This appears to have been the case for Isabella and John. We know about Isabella's story primarily through the records of visitations made by the Bishop of Lincoln. Episcopal visitations were official inspections of religious houses within a bishop's diocese, designed to ensure that rules were being followed, finances were in order, and the spiritual life of the community was healthy. These records often reveal the human dramas and failings that occurred behind monastic walls. Sometime, likely in the first or second decade of the 1300s, Isabella de Benstede and John de Marienthron decided to act on their feelings. They made a pact and fled St. Mary de Pray together. This was an act of double apostasy, she abandoning her vows as a nun, he his vows and duties as a priest. It was a profound scandal. They were not just leaving their posts, they were, in the eyes of the Church, damning their souls and setting a terrible example. The couple went on the run, living together in secular attire, meaning they shed their religious habits for ordinary clothes, trying to blend in and start a new life. For how long they remained at large is not precisely clear, but it was long enough for their absence and the scandalous nature of their departure to become a serious concern for the church authorities. The Bishop of Lincoln, upon learning of their flight and cohabitation, was incensed. Orders were issued for Isabella and John to be found and apprehended. They were excommunicated, a severe penalty that cut them off from the sacraments and the community of the faithful. This meant they could not attend Mass, receive communion, or be buried in consecrated ground, a terrifying prospect in the deeply religious society of medieval England. The hunt for the runaway nun and her chaplain lover was on. Eventually, it seems the pressure became too much, or perhaps their life on the run was not what they had envisioned. The records indicate that Isabella de Benstede later sought to be reconciled with the Church. There is a reference to a plea from her to be absolved from her excommunication and allowed to enter a different, possibly stricter religious order. This suggests she may have been caught, or perhaps she came forward out of remorse. Or maybe the relationship with John de Marienthron had ended, leaving her isolated and facing the spiritual consequences of her actions. What happened to John de Marienthron is less clear from the readily available details concerning Isabella. He, too, would have faced severe ecclesiastical penalties. As for Isabella, if she was allowed to re-enter monastic life, it would have been under strict penance, and likely in a convent far from St. Mary de Pré, where her reputation would be unknown or where she could live out her days in quiet atonement. Isabella de Benstade's escape with John de Marienthron is a poignant story of forbidden love, clashing with religious duty. It goes the fact that even within the most sacred enclosures, human passions could ignite, leading individuals to risk everything, their reputations, their spiritual standing, and their earthly security, for a chance at a life together, however fleeting or fraught with peril the chance might be. Her story, preserved in the dry administrative records of a bishop, gives us a glimpse into the deeply personal struggles and desperate choices made by those who found themselves on the wrong side of the convent wall.